part of the 1900s, the Waldo Anderson family moved to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and settled on a peninsula that extended to the edge of Biloxi Bay. 3 sons, Peter, Walter, and James McConnell, built and developed a pottery business that retained much of the 1900 charm even today. The pottery the 3 sons developed retains a character that is unique and reflective of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Shearwater Pottery exists today much in the same manner it existed 50 years or more. The buildings, the original pieces of pottery, the equipment, and the Andersons are Shearwater Pottery.
The shearwater that we know here along the coast is called the black skimmer. He has a beautiful red bill and red feet with quite a long wingspan. It's black on the top and white underneath. But when they were naming the pottery, they didn't want to call it the Anderson pottery. So the 3 of them hit on shearwater. And they made a symbol of a shearwater out of tin and put it on the sign and said, "Follow the shearwater."
Mrs. Meir Anderson was an artist herself and probably the motivating force in bringing the family to Ocean Springs.
She lived, of course, in New Orleans, and they had a very nice place. They were out on the river, on the levee. But she wanted to go to different places and see different things and have new experiences. And she had a little habit of just taking off for some place. She just maybe to spend the day. And on one of those occasions, she took the coast train. And the coast train, of course, for, I bet 100 years, the coast train ran from New Orleans to Ocean Springs. Ocean Springs was the official turnaround. And we had a turntable where they turned the engine by hand for way up into my memory. And so one day she took the coast train, came out to Ocean Springs, and she got off and she wandered up Washington Avenue, which is that old main street with the beautiful oaks and things. And she fell in love with it right away. And presently as she walked, she came to a real estate office. And immediately she dashed in and she said, "Is there any property for sale around here?" And he said, "Well, not much, because people were not selling things in those days. They just lived on their own property." But it happened that the DePasses, who owned this little point, about 24 acres, had at that time, Mr. DePass had gotten a job in Chicago, I think, and he was moving, and he decided to sell it. And she bought it just like that, immediately. And then Peter decided to be a potter. And when he decided to be a potter, I think one of the factors was that the old Biloxi potter, George Orr, died about that time. And his family had his wheel for sale, his old kick wheel that he had used, and Peter was able to buy it. And at this same time, the potter who was working for Newcomb in New Orleans for years had a pottery. And he had a summer place, a sort of a camp out on Deer Island. And Peter contacted him and asked if he would help him learn how to throw on the wheel. And he said yes. And he told Peter to come on out to his place on Deer Island. So one day, Peter got in a rowboat and rowed out there. And he gave him some clay, showed him a little bit about centering, and a little bit about throwing on the wheel. Not very much, just a little bit. And gave him some more clay and said, now you go to work. And Peter did. And I think that Peter must have been a natural, because later, when he got sort of tired and the sun began to set and he thought perhaps he better row home before it got dark, he asked him. He said, when shall I come back? I think I better go home now. And the man said, oh, you don't need to come back. Just keep working.
When I started pottery, I didn't really know where it would wind up. I didn't know whether it had a future or not, and neither did any of the rest of us. So we just kept on as with what knowledge we had of making pottery, and that wasn't too much. We didn't know much about the possibilities of the local clay and how good they'd turn out to be.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and marriage made it necessary for the three sons to have an income. They pooled their knowledge of design, pottery, and marketing, and did in fact develop the native clay and began to market pottery.
They made up a great big batch, and they thought they'd really startle New Orleans, you know. They drove to New Orleans to sell their figures, and parked on the side of the street and right in the middle of New Orleans. They didn't have any response at all.
It's a funny thing, but if you have something to sell, salesmen sort of look you up. And we had salesmen that approached us that were located in the east and the west, and they went to all of the big stores.
And then we started wholesaling the figures, and we made lists of them, and we would sell a great many of them. We had this jobber on the West Coast that would sell them, and you could sell all you could make then. They had certain ones that were popular, the pirates that were popular, and the Negro figures that were popular. And then a friend that used to help in the shop, she moved to California. And while she was there, she had worked with the figures so she would recognize them anywhere. And here were these small figures, just about, well, let's see, they were about a third as big as the original figures that had been taken to Japan and copied and brought back.
You can truthfully say, I guess, that Shearwater Pottery has been all over the world. We've shipped it to South Africa and Australia, New Guinea, almost anywhere you can think of.
The native clay was developed, and Shearwater Pottery prospered. Peter developed the techniques, Mac and his father Waldo developed the marketing aspect of the business, and Walter concentrated on the design. Before the native clay is usable, it must go through several processes.
When we get it, it's a little damp. Of course, that has to be dried out. And then when it's thoroughly dried, we crush it up and put it right into the blender with the other materials. And it comes out ready to use in the casting molds or ready to be pressed in the pressing tank. And put on the wheel as jigger body, a throwing body. I'll pour it into the molds for castings more or less moderate size. Castware.
Okay, that's the plunger right here. That's where we mix the slip up. Put in clay and feldspar and flint, a little bit of silica or soda to deflocculate it. Comes out of there and goes through a 40 mesh screen, goes into the tank. That's a press tank. Air pressure presses the slip into the filter press. The way a filter press works, there's a hollow face on each one of these leaves here, and slip goes into it, and water comes out through the cloth, and the clay stays in.
And right now, we've been using a local clay from about 60 miles or so from our present site, where there's several outcroppings, and we find that that body is more practical for all three processes we use than anything we've had before, as well as being of a reasonable cost. So we're not importing our clay from a distance, but find it near enough to make it practical to get with a small truck we have.
Once the clay is ready for use on the wheel, it is ready for the first step in throwing and centering.
This is the centering process, and as soon as a piece of clay is centered in the middle of the wheel, it's brought up to a cone like this, starting at the base. It's shoved up to a tall, tapering cone, and then depressed again into a ball. And from that point on, you make it where it's taken off the hump. You can make larger wear or smaller wear depending on your demand or your capability. Your capability sometimes figure more than others, depending on the condition of the clay. The clay itself has to be thoroughly weared and the right temper, otherwise it might be a little bit difficult centering. Now that the hump is centered, all you have to do is keep it in the center of the wheel with no variation. And then it's quite easy to take small wear off just as you make it. The body itself has already been through 2 or 3 processes to make it usable on the wheel. First it goes into a plunger as fluid clay and comes out of the plunger, passing through a 60 mesh screen and into the fill press tank. There it goes under 100 pounds pressure through the press cloth. Comes out of the press, dried, and then it's wedged on the wheel, and then it's ready to use on the throwing wheel, or in the jigger mode. Then you use a sponge stick before the piece is removed from the wheel. The sponge stick takes out superfluous water. Otherwise, wouldn't tolerate and would crack the piece as it dries. Thrown well, like any other formative process in making pottery, requires concentration and strict attention to what you're doing, as well as a good deal of experience. The throwing process is much easier to acquire in some cases than others, probably depending on the natural capabilities for concentration in the individual. But I've been throwing for quite a long time. I always found that the throwing itself was not so much the problem as getting the piece the right proportion and the right weight for its size, unless you weighed it out on the wheel and made similar wear. When you make similar wear, you might just as well use molds, in my opinion, as do the throwing on the wheel to obtain similarity for small wear. Casting process and jiggering process both lend themselves to repetition much more than throwing does. Of course, with throwing, like the other processes, the characteristics and quality of the clay have a lot to do with the outcome.
In Shearwater Pottery, the finished greenware is placed in a drying room to allow the ware to dry evenly. Once the pottery has been dried to a bone-dry stage, it is ready for the kiln. The kiln at Shearwater is an oil-fired downdraft kiln. It is fired about twice a month when enough greenware has been produced to fill it.
Now we fire the kiln about 18 to 20 times a year, and maybe every 2 months we have a series of 3 firings, sometimes more, sometimes less. It varies depending on the rate of production. Sometimes with dry weather we're able to make wear faster because we use no artificial drying process. And the pottery itself has always been kept interesting, to us at least, because we were not subjected to large orders. And large orders very often interfere with the possible creativity of the producer. Creativity varies with your capability, education, and knowledge of the techniques involved. And of course that makes a difference in your state of mind, whether you get a good kiln, good for the morale, a poor kiln, poor for the morale.
We use saggers largely to control the draft in that kiln because you got 3 burners and you try to space the bungs with saggers about the same distance apart. And that kind of draws the fire where you want it instead of having hot spots and cold spots. Also, if you got the glazed ware inside a sagger and you get a little reduction, say, for just a little while, it doesn't get inside the sagger so fast.
And the firing itself is the main test of a potter's capability. After he's made the ware, he's got to put it in the kiln and risk the whole sum of his efforts in one short period of about 10 or 12 hours.
One of the processes used at Shearwater Pottery is jiggering. Jiggering is a way of increasing productivity. The potters at Shearwater Pottery have developed their own molds. The distinction of their products is reflected in the manner in which it is decorated.
We started using the jiggering process when we first began trying to enlarge the production of the pottery. And it was the reason it was so advantageous was that anyone could learn jiggering. It's a simple process.
Jiggering is a soft mud molding process where the mold revolves on the wheel. The mold makes one side of the piece, and a template blade makes the other side from the pull down arm. About the next day, usually, if the weather's normally dry or not too wet, you take the wear out of the molds, put it back on the wheel, and trim it some. And if it was done properly, it doesn't have air bubbles in it. You see that by not putting too much clay in at one time. Molds, you can use them more often than casting molds. You don't have to let them dry out so much because you're not using as wet a product in it.
And the problem was selling pottery. And plain pottery sells fairly well, but if you have it mixed with decorated pottery, it sells twice as fast. It's a variety that you want. So I got into the decorating business just for wanting to put variety into the showrooms. In fact, about everything I do is trying to put variety into the showroom.
When I started working here about 3 years ago, everybody was reproducing my uncle's work because of the demand for it. And they were using stencils and what have you, things like that. They asked me to do a few too. So I started out using the stencils like they were, and got to a point where I didn't like using them. They were getting in the way as I was trying to reproduce the work. So I didn't use it one day. I quit using them and started doing it freehand, and it worked out a lot easier that way. It was much more, it was a lot looser than what the stencils gave it. It kind of gave the feel that Walter's work had, the free lines and the things like that. The flow that his work has kind of came out at when I did it freehand. And from there, everybody said, well, you know how to control the paint and you can do it like that. Why don't you do your own work? Which is kind of a different thing. It's a big step. But about a year after that, I started trying my own things. My husband and I live about 12 miles from here, and every day on the way into work, we go over a causeway that has a lot of marshlands around it. And these pieces all have a resemblance to that. They all have the water lilies and the animal life from that area. The snowy egrets and the fiddlers and the turtles, and dragonflies and boat-tailed grackles and kingfishers. That I see those every day as I go home and come to work. And one day I picked up a piece that was still leather hard and started doodling on it, and that's what came out with the water lilies.
Originally as a partnership with Mr. and Mrs. Anderson and Peter and Walter and Mac. And now it's mostly Peter, because Peter's the one that stuck with it, and Jimmy is the young potter, so he will gradually take over and do that. And Margaret took over Mrs. Peter Anderson's job. She runs the business end of it now.
Shearwater Pottery, the Andersons as Mississippi, as the Marshes, the Gulf, and the distinctively creative art it produces. Peter, Walter, and Mac developed the techniques, and just as they have molded clay into a finished product, the younger Andersons are being molded into the tradition of Shearwater pottery and will carry on that tradition that the Andersons have been noted for the last 50 years.